Hello and welcome back to the next episode of my NHL Deep Dive series. Today we're talking about the Vegas Golden Knights. I have them ranked number 9 going into the season, and it was another pretty eventful offseason for Vegas. I mean, that seems to be kind of par for the course of this team now, is that they're always going to be hanging around in that excitement bubble, trying to always make moves and improve this team. And I think this is maybe the first offseason where I think Vegas kind of got worse across the board. And we'll jump into the offseason moves here for now. And they bring in Alexander Holtz and Victor Olofsson, who we're going to both talk about them later. They lose Anthony Mantha, Jonathan Marchessault, William Carrier, Chandler Stevenson, Michael Mario, and Paul Cutter. That's a lot. Like they got gutted offensively. And that's the biggest reason why this team is as low as they are. Although this is kind of the start this onwards is the start of my like Stanley Cup bubble. Vegas is the first, like there's 9 teams that I think are in my Stanley Cup window. Vegas is the worst of those 9 going into the season. And I'm somebody who loves Vegas. So like that's, I love the way the roster construction has done, the hyper aggressiveness of Vegas. But this was an offseason where they kind of just had to cut their losses. And the big ones obviously being Chandler Stevenson and Jonathan Marchessault. But I mean, Anthony Mantha, they brought in as kind of a hired gun last season, and he was never going to come back. William Carrier, Amadio, and Cutter are just kind of depth options that they lose, but they're all very good depth options. And Vegas is going to have trouble replacing those kind of guys. I mean, obviously, Marchessault and Chandler Stevenson, they're hoping they can get decent production out of Victor Olofsson and Alexander Holtz to cover those. But as of now, that's a downgrade too. So defensively, they only lose Alec Martinez, but I mean, Alec Martinez is a solid defenseman, and they didn't replace him with anybody. So now this is a blue line that, even with the loss of Alec Martinez, is still one of the best in the NHL, and we'll get into that blue line. So it's not like they downgraded significantly just because they lost Martinez, but I mean, they lose a solid defenseman, they don't replace him. So by virtue of that, it is a downgrade. And then net, they bring in Ilya Samsonov and Akir Schmid, and they lose Logan Thompson, who I like, but I think essentially this is Logan Thompson for Ilya Samsonov. I think Thompson's a better goalie, but I don't think it's a huge downgrade. So they get the slight downgrade for that, but maybe Schmid can figure out, maybe he ends up becoming a decent NHL goalie as well at some point. Jumping into this forward core, they're ranked 23rd for me, which is a lot lower than I thought they'd be. But I mean, you look at the guys they lost this summer. I mean, this is an offense that, we've talked about Marchessault and Stevenson already. This is an offense that would have been significantly better with both those guys in it. But, as of now, you look at this offense, and Jack Eichel is the biggest piece. I mean, he's the star of this offense at this point. He's taken the reins away from Mark Stone being the best player on this core. And Jack Eichel is like a player that I've always liked. I think he got a lot of bad rep in Buffalo just because of how bad Buffalo was. And he's really come into his own as like proving that he can be, number one line center on a Stanley Cup winning team. And he was. So for me, like this team kind of has to rely on everybody being healthy. That's the first thing. But it's also going to be, what can they do around a guy like Jack Eichel? And center wise, I mean, this team is solid enough, but I think, you look at somebody like a Thomas Hertl, who I guess I can jump to quickly. He's somebody that I'd probably rather have playing on the wing at some point. And I mean, if this team could find themselves, even it doesn't even have to be a third line center, because you can move, William Karlsson up to the 2 seed. You can play Nick Waugh as your 3 seed. And if you can just find another, C plus level center to be your fourth line center, I mean, you have a really solid center core, and they need to improve on the wings. That's the biggest issue for this team, right? I mean, like Ivan Barbashev's there, who has looked pretty solid in Vegas since he got traded, and he was somebody I didn't love, pre Vegas. So he kind of came into his own there. But I mean, you look at everybody else here. I mean, Door Five, somebody who he looked okay last year. I mean, he had flashes of looking fine, but he's not somebody I'd rely on to be a second line winger. But I mean, below that, you have Bryson, and who is somebody who needs to have a great season. Like he needs to have a breakout season this year. He's going to have an opportunity. He's the best prospect, I guess, if you want to call him that still, that Vegas has that hasn't really had a chance to play yet. And he's going to get a chance this year because they have no bottom six forwards right now, and Brett Howden, who had an atrocious regular season, had a very good playoffs. So hopefully he can kind of carry on what he did in the playoffs last year into this season. But around that, I mean, you look at the other side, right? It's Victor Olofsson and Alexander Holtz. Those are kind of the two guys who they need one of them to break out. And I mean, Victor Olofsson looked very promising his rookie season, and then really hasn't developed since then. So maybe a change of scenery for him is the way to go. I mean, Alexander Holtz really hasn't had a chance to break out at all, and a lot of that has to be do with the fact that it was a difficult roster to crack in New Jersey because of how deep they are. But it's also just like his his value since the draft has really shot down because he hasn't proven that he can break into a roster, into a top six and play. And again, maybe a change of scenery is going to be there. He's going to have a ton of opportunity here in Vegas. And those are kind of the two guys that I'm looking at to breakout might not be the right word. It is for Holtz, but it might not be for Olofsson, but just bounce back, right? Like you might be talking about comeback player of the year candidate. And I think Victor Olofsson is near the top of that list just because of the opportunity he's going to get, right? He's going to be playing with very good players, not like he wasn't in Buffalo, but it's a different environment, right? Like playing in Vegas compared to Buffalo right now, like the energy around the team, the expectations around the team are very different. Olofsson's somebody who has shown the ability to look like a competent top six forward, and we saw that, even in his rookie year, he had a very solid rookie season. If he can find that next gear, playing with guys like Jack Eichel and Barbashev and Thomas Hertl and Mark Stone, wherever they end up fitting him in, that could be a really productive player. And same with Alexander Holtz, right? Like he's somebody else who this is kind of his, maybe a change of scenery is the move. And it's not like he was on a bad team, right? Like the Devils were a very good roster. Last year, obviously, they had injuries and a bunch of stuff affecting them and terrible goaltending. But those are kind of the two guys in this offense that if the Vegas Golden Knights are going to be, a top half of the league offense or better, they need both those guys to have great seasons, and not maybe not great, but they need them both to step up and have better seasons than what they are currently ranked as. And I think Alexander Holtz probably has more pop potential than Victor Olofsson does. But if Victor Olofsson can go from a C minus to a C plus, and Alexander Holtz can go from like a C minus to even a B minus, that would be ideal. And that's a big ask, right? Like that's a pretty substantial ask. But if they could both even become C plus players, or one of them becomes a C, one of them becomes a C plus type level player, that would be beneficial on its own. But even then, I don't know if Vegas has enough firepower compared to what they have had in the last couple of years to be considered in even like the good offense tiers, right? And it's not going to be the strength of this team. It really isn't, because even like their top guys, I mean, like Jack Eichel obviously is going to be is a pretty close to being a generational offensive player, but you look at everything else around that. How many points do you expect to get out of Ivan Barbashev, right? Like how many points do you expect to get out of him? How many games do you expect Mark Stone to play this year, let alone points, right? Like you can't rely on him to play the whole season. And then Thomas Hertl, right? Like even somebody like Hertl has seen a bit of a downshift in his productivity, and I mean he didn't look he was obviously coming off an injury when he got traded to Vegas. So take his performance post trade with a grain of salt. But even his last couple of years in San Jose, weren't great. And his underlying numbers have fallen off a bit. So like, that's somebody who also is kind of a reclamation project in a way, right? Like they kind of threw a bunch of money at, I guess not money in the sense of they signed Hertl, but in terms of assets for the future and cap space for the future at Thomas Hertl, hoping it's going to work out, right? Very much. Obviously, I don't think it comes with the same risk, but very similar to kind of what Washington did with Pierre-Luc Dubois, right? Where they just kind of they believe enough in their system and that he's going to fit to just will take on most of that salary in this case, or in all the salary case. And I'm not saying that Pierre-Luc Dubois and Thomas Hurdle comparable players. I think Thomas Hurdle's a significantly better hockey player, but it's the same kind of situation where they just kind of they threw a bunch of cap space at this guy because of the potential that he has, not necessarily in like a Jack Eichel case where like he was already an established like elite player and they just wanted to add him to the roster. This is very much a reclamation project in a way with Thomas Hurdle, and it's going to have to be. And again, if they can move Hurdle to the wing and they can find another solid center to fill in that spot, for filling maybe even that third line spot, this team looks better, right? Like they don't have to necessarily go get a top tier winger. They could move Hurdle to the wing and solve some of their issues that way too. So there's a world where this team does work out, and Keegan Kolesar's there too, and he's a fine fourth liner. I don't have a problem with him. But there's a world where Vegas figures this out, and based on the moves they made in their front office, like I mean, if there's a team that's going to be able to acquire a high end, forward, it's going to be Vegas, right? So that doesn't concern me as much as it would for other teams. I mean, this was my dream destination for Mitch Marner. And I mean, imagine Mitch Marner on that top line with Eichel and Barbashev, and you kind of slide everybody else down, right? Now, all of a sudden, you have, Olofsson playing with Carlson and Holtz on the third line, maybe. That offense looks a heck of a lot better, right? But again, that was more of a dream trade scenario than it was something that was likely to happen. But hey, maybe, the Mitch Marner deal doesn't get done. And we get close to the trade deadline or even close to like December and January. I don't know, right? Like I don't. That's just me, fantasy booking, but it feels like a team that's going to be in on them, right? But yeah, like overall, like this team still has the top stars, but even like their top players, there's nobody here outside of Jack Eichel that I'd be confident saying is going to be like even a 70-point player at the end of the year. Like I think Hurdle has potential to do that. I think a healthy Mark Stone has potential to do that. But I don't know if I'd bet on it, right? Like I don't know if I'm betting on any of those guys getting, guaranteed to hit 70 this year. And that's kind of uncharted territory for Vegas, right? Like I think Hurdle's probably the next most likely on this team just because I don't know what Stone's health is going to be. But like that's kind of the big question is who's the next like who's going to be the guy putting up a ton of points with this team. And that option might come on the blue line, honestly. And again, I don't know if there's a true dynamic offensive player on this blue line, but man, this blue line's good. And that'll transition us into the blue line, which I love. This is my second ranked blue line in the NHL. It is 1 point behind tying for my number one blue line in the NHL. And it starts with Shea Theodore, who's just like Shea Theodore is like might be like he's one of the best well-rounded defensemen in the NHL. He's in that conversation for the most like you talk about five-tool players in baseball. He might be a five-tool player in hockey, and just a guy who can do everything exceptionally well. And he might not be great at one thing, but he's just so well-rounded, right? I think Adam Fox is probably the number one guy in that category, and Shea Theodore's close. Like he's in that conversation. And again, he's not somebody who's going to put up 80 points a season, but maybe this is the year that happens. But around him, like the talent is there too. I mean, Noah Hannafin, I think, is now the second best defenseman on this team, just because the Alex Pietrangelo fall off has started to happen a little bit. But even Alex Pietrangelo, right? Like, is your third best defenseman being, in that high end top line, first number one defenseman tier is pretty remarkable. Like, it's a blue line that is stacked. Now, the Shea Theodore contract situation is what it is, and that's looming over this team, and that's why I thought maybe a Theodore Marner swap with some added assets either way made a lot of sense to me. Because then Toronto gets their true number one defenseman, Vegas gets their number one dynamic playmaking winger. It kind of made sense, but you're still here, and both these guys are on those teams, so that fantasy booking really didn't happen. But as of now, I mean, this blue line is the strength of this team easily by far. And I mean, you talk about the other guys on this blue line, right? I mean, like Hannafin, also a very good two-way defenseman. Alex Pietrangelo, fantastic two-way defenseman. Maybe not to where he was like when he won a cup in St. Louis or his first year in Vegas, but he's still up there as one of the better two-way defensemen in the NHL. And even like a Braden McNabb, right? Like Braden McNabb might not have the like super crazy offensive pop, but he's still a very good transition player. And he's a pretty well-rounded defenseman as your four option. And then you have, Nick Hague and Zach Whitecloud as your third pair, which is a pretty solid third pairing. I mean, we've seen the other blue lines around the NHL, right? Like, I mean, Nick Hague and Zach Whitecloud is up there for one of the better third pairs that we've seen in this series so far, right? And we got 8 teams to go. So all around, this blue line is just it's so loaded with stars. And this is what Vegas does, right? I mean, you look at the guys on this blue line, right? Noah Hannafin, they traded for this deadline, right? Like, we talk about guys who are going to be big impact players. Noah Hannafin and Thomas Hurdle haven't even played like half a season in Vegas yet. And they just traded for them at the deadline. It's crazy how this team's just constantly able to just acquire talent. And that's why I have my concerns with the offense right now as it stands. And I'm sure the number one priority at Vegas right now is, hey, we need to go, look to try to trade for a forward. Like that's the conversation that's happening because that's what this front office does is they're just constantly trying to improve this roster. And I respect the hell out of it. Like, Jonathan Marchand had his quote about, there being no loyalty in this team, but you always got a chance to win a cup. And that's so true. And players understand that, right? You like if you get traded to Vegas or you sign in Vegas, you understand that like this team could trade you for nothing, like instantly. But you're always going to be in that cup window. And they still are in my cup window. Now they're at the bottom of it right now because the offense is nowhere near where it should be to be a Stanley Cup contending team. And the goaltending tandem isn't great, but the potential for the acquisition of talent that this team has always is going to be there as like a constant like hanging, it's like a little bell ringing in your ear saying that hey, this team could, like wake up tomorrow and uh, Mitch Marner's a Vegas Golden Knight, and I'd be like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And that's always going to be there. And this blue line showcases that. I mean, you look at the you look at the acquisition of talent that the blue line's had. And I mean, Pietrangelo was a free agent signing. Shea Theodore was traded for the expansion draft, right? Like Nick Hague was an acquisition they made. Braden McNabb was an acquisition they made. Noah Hannafin was last year, right? Like it's just that's what this team does, man. And they find guys who fit. And this blue line, not only is it filled with talent, but it should be a really cohesive unit. And that's so exciting. Like it's gonna be so much fun to watch. This might be my favorite. The most excited I am to watch a blue line is in Vegas because of how instantly cohesive I think they're gonna be. And that's important because we move on to the goaltending tandem, and I have them tied for 16th right now. And Aiden Hill is going to have to maybe not take on like a bigger load because I think Ilya Samsonov can still play a similar amount of games to Logan Thompson, but I think it's slightly less stable in the fact that Logan Thompson's a slightly better goalie. Now, I think Ilya Samsonov is kind of my bounce back goalie candidate this year because he's going to be in a perfect situation for it. He's going to have one of the best, if not the best, blue line in the NHL behind him. He has a forward core that may not outscore a lot of teams, but is still super defensively responsible from top to bottom. And he's going to be playing in a less intense market, although still a very good market, and a loyal market, but a market that isn't Toronto. And he's not going to be the starter, right? And we saw him have flashes at the end of last season when Joe Woll was taking on some of those bigger games where he looked more comfortable as kind of the backup, the 1B on that team. And that's what he's going to be in Vegas right now. And they still have Akira Schmidt, who also, maybe not last year, but has shown brief flashes of being, an NHL capable goaltender. So it might not be Logan Thompson stable, but it is going to still be a stable enough goaltending tandem in the context of everything around them, right? Like if this tandem was on a couple of teams that were lower on this board that didn't have as very good, like if this was Vancouver's tandem this year, I'd feel a lot less safe about it. But because of the way Vegas' roster is formatted, I feel pretty okay about, Aiden Hill and Ilya Samsonov as the tandem here. And, that's great. And I mean, like, it's not like Aiden Hill's, shut the lights out as a starter these last couple years outside of the playoff run. And even then, Vegas was pretty pretty well known to be one of the top, two or three teams that year, regardless. But he's somebody who can do a good enough job to, he's not going to lose you games. And that's kind of what Vegas needs at this point. They need guys who aren't going to lose them games. And I don't think Elias Samson is going to lose them a lot of games either. So overall, like, you can't complain about that goaltending tandem, although it doesn't, it's not the Robin Leonard, Marc Andre Fleury tandem from a couple of years ago. Uh, but yeah, that's about it. I mean, I like Vegas. I really like Vegas. I think they have, potential to obviously shoot up. It's Vegas. They could do something crazy that we don't expect. And all of a sudden they look like, a true top end Stanley Cup bubble team. But I don't know. Let me know what you think of Vegas. I think they're very, very intriguing team. And I mean, they always are. They've been one of the most, if not the most intriguing team in hockey since the second they stepped into the league. And that's fun. Like, I like it. I love Vegas's team building strategy. I think it's super unique, and it works. Obviously, I mean, they won a cup based on it, and they're always going to kind of be in that conversation. But we'll see what happens. Yeah, let me know what you think down below, and yeah, let me know where you think Vegas finishes, because I think there's kind of a wide range for this team. I mean, I could see a world where this team completely flops. The offense doesn't click, somebody gets hurt, and they could, be a fringe playoff, if not miss the playoff team entirely. Or I could see a world where everything clicks. Alexander Holtz becomes the top six winger that he was drafted to be, and uh, you know we're talking about Vegas winning the Pacific and being in the contention for the President's Trophy, and that's why they're in the Stanley Cup bubble, because I think they're legitimately a Stanley Cup contender. But let me know what you think down below, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.